This writing tip is about creating characters from plot. Well, if you already have a story idea, it's a simple matter to create a whole cast of characters that will grow out of your plot. And in this writing tip, we're going to lay out a method for developing characters from a thumbnail sketch of what your story is about. So, what's a thumbnail sketch? Well, it's simply a short description, only a line or two, less than a paragraph, that gets right to the heart of the matter of your story. You see them all the time in the TV guide listings and in short descriptions that show up on cable or satellite television program information screens. A thumbnail sketch of The Matrix, for example, might read, "A computer hacker discovers that the world we know is really just a huge computer program. He is freed from the program by a group of rebels intent on destroying the system and ultimately joins them as their most powerful cyber warrior." Well, clearly there's a lot more to the finished movie than that, but the thumbnail sketch does provide enough information to get a good feel for what the story is about. So generally such a description contains information about the plot, since the audience will choose what they want to watch, or the reader will choose what they want to read, based on the kind of things they expect to happen in a story. If it's an action story, there may be no mention of characters at all, as in, "A giant meteor threatens to demolish the Earth. Dun dun dun!" But if it's a love story, there may be little plot but several characters, as in, "A young Amish woman falls in love with a traveling salesman. Her father and his chosen match for her oppose the romance, but her free-minded mother and exiled aunt encourage her." Well, whether or not the characters are specifically mentioned in the thumbnail sketch, they're always at least inferred. So, for your own story, the first step is to come up with a short description, like those used as illustrations a moment ago. And for the purposes of this lesson, we'll propose the following hypothetical story to use as an example. Suppose our story is described as the tribulations of a town marshal trying to fend off a gang of outlaws who bleed the town dry. Well, let's begin with the expected characters. The only explicitly called for characters are the marshal and the gang, so we'll list them as required characters of the story. Certainly you could tell a story with just those characters, but it might seem a little underpopulated. In fact, realistically, you'd expect the gang to have a leader and the town to have a mayor. The marshal might have a deputy, and if the town is being bled dry, then some businessmen and shopkeepers would be in order as well. So the second stage of the process is to step a bit beyond what's actually written and to slightly enlarge the dramatic world to describe and include the secondary and support characters as well. Now, let's move on to the usual characters, the usual suspects. Range a little bit wider, list some characters that aren't necessarily expected but wouldn't seem particularly out of place in such a story as yours. Well, in our example, that might be a saloon girl, a bartender, blacksmith, rancher, preacher, school teacher, etc. You get the idea. Now it's time to let yourself go a little bit more and look at some characters that would seem somewhat out of place but still explainable in such a story. Unusual characters. For example, a troupe of traveling acrobats, Ulysses S. Grant, a Prussian duke, or a bird watcher. Well, adding one or two somewhat unexpected characters to a story can liven up the cast and make it seem original rather than predictable. But now let's go for the gold. Outlandish characters. Pull out all the stops and list some completely inappropriate characters that would take a heap of explaining to your reader or audience if they showed up in your story. For example, Richard Nixon, Martians, the ghost of Julius Caesar. Well, although you'll likely discard most of these characters, just the process of coming up with them can lead to new ideas and directions for your story. But you still might find some useful. For example, the town marshal might become more interesting if you were a history buff, specifically reading about the Roman Empire. In his first run-in with the gang, he's knocked out cold with a concussion. Then for the rest of the story, he keeps imagining the ghost of Julius Caesar giving him unwanted advice. Definitely would make your story more original and more interesting. Let's do a casting call now. Let's assemble all of the characters that we've so far proposed for our hypothetical story, be they expected, usual, unusual, or outlandish. So in our example we have expected characters: the marshal, the gang leader, the town mayor, a deputy, businessmen, and shopkeepers. The usual characters, almost said usual suspects again: saloon girl, bartender, blacksmith, rancher, preacher, and school teacher. Then the unusual characters, traveling acrobats, Ulysses S. Grant, Prussian Duke, Birdwatcher, and finally our outlandish characters, Richard Nixon, Martians, and Caesar's Ghost. Well, the task at hand now is to weed out of this list of perspective characters all the ones we're sure we don't want in our story. Well, at first blush this might seem easy, but before you make hazy decisions, keep in mind the use that we came up with for Caesar's Ghost, and now consider how might traveling acrobats be employed dramatically to enhance our story. Well, they might be a place for the marshal to hide in grease paint when the gang temporarily takes over the town. Or how about if the school teacher befriends them and then employs their aid in busting the deputy out of jail when he falls under the gang's control? How about Ulysses S. Grant showing up on his way to a meeting with the governor, and the gang members must impersonate honest townsfolk until he and his armed cavalry escort have departed? Could make for a very tense or a very funny scene depending on how you play it. Well, try to put each of these characters into juxtaposition with each of the others, at least as a mental exercise, to see if any kind of chemistry boils up between them. In this way, you may find that some of the least likely characters in your initial consideration turn out to be almost indispensable in the development of the story you ultimately want to tell. Now, short word about plot. You may or may not have noticed, but a lot of what we've just done with the characters has also had the added benefit of developing whole sequences of events, series of interactions, and additional plot lines. In fact, working with characters in this way can often do as much for your story's plot as it does for the creation of characters themselves. Hence, it's never too early to work with characters. As soon as you have an initial story idea, no matter how lacking in detail or thinly developed it may be, it can pay to work with your characters as a means of adding to your plot. Well, I'm Melanie Ann Phillips, and I hope you'll join us for more writing tips at storymind.com.